With insomnia, nothing's real. Everything's far away. Everything's a copy of a copy of a copy.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to look at Bizarre Brian's logo. It's got a blade that is inside a melting ice cream or ice lolly. What does it mean? At the beginning of this episode, I played a clip from the movie Fight Club where the narrator intones, "With insomnia, nothing's real. Everything's far away. Everything's a copy of a copy of a copy." The key word there is nothing's real. What is real, right? Now, if we look at Brian's bizarre design logo and think about the concept, what is real? What you're seeing is something that appears to be an ice cream, but actually it's something else. It's something hidden in something else. And think about business cards and logos that are copies of copies of copies, right? You give out lots of business cards, you give out lots of logos, right? The other thing that's quite interesting is, broadly speaking, isn't Brian Laundrie's bizarre design logo a knockoff of the soap logo used in Fight Club? It's the same color, it's the same shape, and it also has bits of it glooping off of it. And we also know that Fight Club is, the soap is actually used for something else besides soap. It's used, we know for what, right? In this episode, I'm going to focus more specifically on Brian's self-stating, self-identifying bizarre design logo. So we're going to look more at the logo than at his other art, than his other artistic expressions and so on. We're going to look at what the logo means, and we're going to look at we're going to analyze that rather than his art in general, although I will be touching on that too, including sort of artistic influences. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. Now, for those who don't know me, and perhaps even some of you who do know me quite well, you might ask, what qualifies me to comment on art, design, and psychology? Well, I can tell you I've written over a dozen magazine articles on famous artists. I published a book on Vincent van Gogh. I went to an advertising school where I worked with designers. I'm also a designer myself. I design all my own covers for these YouTube videos. I come from a family of famous full-time artists, some more famous than others. I've got around 4 relatives that have made a name for themselves as artists, and one of them is a household name in my country. Having said all that, art and analysis of art is subjective, so you may have a different opinion, and that is fine. I'm just expressing my opinion on this particular thing, specifically the logo, right? So the first point I want to address is Brian as a copycat, right? Now, I remember as a young kid drawing. Anyone that drew, if you were drawing a picture, anyone that sort of leaned over and drew what you were drawing was sort of frowned on, right? There's nothing wrong with copying as a young child, but copying a sort of unique interpretation, well, that's not always so good. It shows a deficiency in the artist, right? So I just want to go back to the beginning and just ask the question, how good is Brian as a designer? What do you think? How good is Brian as an artist? What do you think? Now, you can go and focus on particular areas if you like, but I'm just going to show you this particular thing. And this is something that Brian has pulled out of his portfolio to brag about on social media. This particular image, and this, of course, is his logo. So I'm going to say that I think that his executions are average on both counts, in terms of his talent as a designer and in terms of his talent as a creative person, as an artist. I do think he's quite good with his lino cuts, but on his own business card, it sort of looks careless and unfinished, perhaps like Brian himself. Perhaps Brian as a person is quite a careless and unfinished person. And so this is a little gripe regarding his business card, but do you notice that he allows the upper @ sign to ride into, to clash into the actual illustration, his logo, right? Now, you might not think too much about that. You might think that's a small mistake to make or something like that. But in handwriting analysis, where you see a lot of words scribbled over, where someone makes an error and they sort of put a lot of barbed wire and just kind of totally, muddy away the word that once was underneath, as opposed to putting a line through it or rewriting the whole thing. This is often a sign of dishonesty or laziness or a person prone to cheating. Now, on something as important as a business card, even a small mistake like this is a mistake, and it really needs to be set right. You really need to start over. You need to do it again. And that takes work. And young adults living at home, used to having everything done by mommy and daddy, probably aren't used to paying the price of getting things right in the real world. And of course, if you make little mistakes on little things, you're likely to make big mistakes on big things. Now, besides that, the logo overall, I think, is poorly executed. It doesn't give me a sense of someone who is executing something in a very, in a way that the overall effect is kind of impressive, right? It just feels fairly poorly executed, fairly amateurish. What does it convey? There are a couple of things to take from this, but I think to start off with, what would a would-be client make of Brian's logo? Brian himself might think it's edgy and cool, but someone who doesn't know him may well intuit a darker import to the bizarre design, and that intuition wouldn't be off track. Think about what we're seeing. It's a blade inside an ice cream, and I came across a story where someone actually found that. A father found a knife blade inside an ice cream that his child was eating. And that certainly wasn't something that I think the father or anyone else was particularly pleased about. Why? Because something like that is a danger to society. And think about the soap in Fight Club as being a danger to society, and ultimately what happens to that soap in the final scenes. So the idea of something sharp and unexpected, something surprising beneath the surface, that idea isn't terrible in terms of, his message as a designer. I once interned for an advertising agency called the Jupiter Drawing Room. The creative director told us once what they always try to do is put not quite sure how to say this. I won't repeat the exact word he used, but it was basically the word for a male phallus. And he said, he drew that on a whiteboard, and he said, you want to put that in all of your work. And what he meant to say was that you must communicate a strong, decisive, memorable, unambiguous, and compelling message. And if it shocks, great. And I can support that, but not when it comes to a logo, and not when one considers the negative associations of this one. So in certain instances, yes, you want to be memorable, you want to stand out from other marketers, other designers, other advertising. But in terms of your logo, especially if you're sending out a message that's ultimately negative or unclear, and that's what happens in this particular one, that doesn't really work then. You need to be quite clear in what you're trying to say. So the other thing with the logo is you want to show your originality. In Brian's case, what you see in all of his work is Brian copying comic books, Brian copying TV characters, Brian copying illustrations on book covers.
Everything's far away. Everything's a copy of a copy of a copy.
And so is Brian. Much as he thinks of himself as unique, in the arena of his bedroom and his engagement and Wabasso Avenue, his uniqueness may be enough, but it's not nearly enough in the real world. You've also got to think of Brian as a designer compared to other designers. all true artists do imitate at some point in their careers. And even Van Gogh was inspired by other artists like Millet, Monet, and Gogh. And there are some artworks by Van Gogh that are literally copies of other artists, but with a little bit of interpretation in that. But the reason Van Gogh is so beloved today is because his work stands out as utterly, vibrantly, and expressively original. It's not easy to be original, but when you are, then you have someone like Vincent van Gogh. In Brian and Gabby's social media, their summer epic basically boils down to a series of his and hers portraits in the same settings. It's not very original, and in a weird way, their social media itself is a copy of a copy of a copy. No one is saying finding your voice as an artist or as an artistic couple is easy. But I can tell you as a creative person, not finding it is even harder, because it means you've got to know that until you do, you're a faker, a fraud. You're not original at the thing that you're supposed to be good at. You're supposed to create something and you can't. You can only copy someone else's creativity. And so what ultimately happens is you find out that you're someone who can't deliver on your own brief. And that is something that is very hard to get over in the silence, in the silent hours where you're scribbling and trying to do something. I do think Brian's logo basically sums that up pretty well. He sees himself as a designer, and the most critical area to demonstrate that is in your logo that defines you, that allows you to strut your stuff. And Brian fails to do that in this most basic area. Let me know if you want me to talk about the logo Brian designed for the Nomadic Static YouTube channel, because there are also certain things to talk about there. Interestingly, he said of that, we came up with a completely original layout, barely spent anything on the conversation, and couldn't be happier with the outcome. And so he's really kind of congratulating himself with a great logo there. What do you guys think of it? It does convey this minimalist sense, but isn't it a bit dull? Isn't it a bit empty? Isn't it a bit flat? And how does this compete with the logos, the whatever of other van lifers? What do you guys think? And that brings us to the second point, which is the Cleon Peterson influence. And that is another artist that Brian has sort of highlighted, mentioned him by name. I don't want to talk too much about Cleon Peterson. There's actually a lot to say. But he is the single artist I've found that Brian Laundrie seems to regard as an inspiration. He seems to think of Peterson's work as, it's in his bedroom and it's in his social media. But just think about Peterson's work in general. What is it? It's generally chaotic and violent. And that's not my interpretation. That is even Cleon Peterson's commentary on his own work. On his website, he describes his work as, quote, clashing figures in a struggle between power and submission in the fluctuating architecture of contemporary society. It's quite important to bear those words in mind. I'm going to repeat them. On the artist's website, Cleon Peterson describes his own work as clashing figures in a struggle between power and submission in the fluctuating architecture of contemporary society. That's a pretty good description of the summer epic, of the Moab incident, of the Mary Piglets incident, and ultimately Gabby's remains being left where they were, at the epilogue of a failed attempt to design and build a contemporary social media architecture for their journey. Instead of an enviable, idyllic fairy tale, what the summer epic demonstrated instead was the triumph of anxiety and fear over love and daydreams. It showed the lengths some people will go to construct a lie and then try to cheat or outrun the consequences when that lie unravels. Some people argued with me on YouTube about some of the depictions from Cleon Peterson. So I've found you these two particular depictions, which I don't think leave one in any doubt about if you are interested in this artist's work, where it can take you, where it can take your mind, and where it possibly took Brian's mind.
How do you get large groups of people to think about reality together, right? In that sense, I can see what you're saying. So then the question is, what is the real world? The interesting thing about Dr. Leyen's paper, and the thing that I found exciting, was that he is saying with the existentialist philosophers that the real world is terrible, is terrifying. And this is where I think the great truth is emerging in our time, that the pretensions that people are making about the real world are not valid. That indeed, groups of people should now be getting together to see that what we call reality is a terrifying thing into which a human animal creature is immersed and which threatens at all times to overwhelm him. If he sees the reality of that threat and he can't quite bear up to it, we call him mentally ill.
So that was Ernest Becker talking in February 21, 1972, about a month before I was actually born. And for some of you listening, that's still a really, really long time ago. But basically, he was talking, 50 odd years ago about something that is absolutely true today and absolutely true in the story of Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie. It's this inability to overcome anxiety. It's this inability to discern reality. And I think those two go hand in hand. Part of the reason that you can't deal with reality is anxiety. And part of the reason you can't deal with anxiety is reality. So what do? And that audio clip comes from ernestbecker.org. I'll put a link to that in the description. Now, there's a lot I want to still talk about in terms of anxiety, in terms of what Ernest Becker talks about when he talks about anxiety. But I want to just move on to the basic thing that we take from this logo, and that is something that I think is quite obvious, but it's maybe quite difficult to express in a word. And what is that word? What is a knife or a razor blade in an ice cream? Well, it's sadistic. It's sadism. What is a soap bar that is used as an explosive? Well, the same thing. And so someone who's sadistic is preoccupied with violence. It is someone who purposefully manipulates others through the use of fear. And isn't that what is the case here? Brian was preoccupied with violent literature. And doesn't that sort of bear fruit? Doesn't that come out in his creative impulse through this violent depiction of a knife inside something that appears to be harmless, a melting ice lolly? And I do think that's quite a good depiction of Brian himself, that, who he is on the outside is this melting individual. And what is he on the inside? There are many kinds of sadism, but one kind that I think is quite interesting is spineless sadism. And that includes the avoidant personality. The personality traits of a spineless sadist is someone who's insecure, cowardly. A lot of what he does is bogus. It's not real. There's a lot of venomous dominance. There's weakness counteracted by group support and public swaggering. Isn't that what we saw during the Moab incident? And he also selects powerless scapegoats. In that particular case, well, wasn't it Gabby? Now, you might think that sadistic tendencies only occur in criminals, but they don't. They exist in everybody. And they strongly link to a greater aggressive behavior. So anyone you find who tends to be aggressive all the time probably has a sadistic streak in them as well. Quoting from an article in Science Daily, and I'll put a link to that also in the description, it says, quote, "In the real world, sadists might be someone bullying others to feel better, or a group of sports fans looking for rival fans to fight for the excitement of it." I think all of us have recognized that sort of thing. Think about the sadism in the movie Fight Club. I also want you to think of this idea of sadism, which is where you derive pleasure from a particular violent action And this whole idea of strangling someone and seeing them suffering under your hands and getting some kind of sense of supremacy over, in this particular situation. There's another aspect I also wanted to address, which is the, in terms of the blade within the ice cream, it's also representative of someone wearing a mask, of someone presenting a particular exterior while there's another interior. Something that has been very well depicted in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the book by Robert Louis Stevenson. And, that came out in 1886. But the whole vernacular phrase Jekyll and Hyde refers to people with an unpredictable dual nature, outwardly good, but sometimes shockingly evil. And doesn't that describe the person we're talking about here? Doesn't that also describe the logo? Outwardly good, an ice cream, but shockingly evil on the inside. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.